Lydia Carter was fired in front of everyone because she gave one bowl of soup to a poor old woman standing in the rain outside the hotel restaurant. The manager called it a disgrace. The guests called it embarrassing. The other waiters laughed behind polished trays. But Lydia did not regret it, not even for 1 second. What nobody inside the Grand Aurelia Hotel understood was that the poor old woman was not poor at all. She was Ruth Montgomery, mother of the billionaire CEO. And before night fell, her son would sit inside his private office, watch the security footage, and see exactly who had shown his mother mercy. Lydia had worked at the Grand Aurelia for 8 months. The hotel glittered with marble floors, gold elevators, glass chandeliers, and guests who never looked down. But behind the kitchen doors, everything was different. The hotel was beautiful in public, yet cruel in private, especially to workers who had no protection. Every morning before her shift, Lydia stood near the staff entrance, closed her eyes and whispered, "Lord, help me stay kind when people are not kind." She needed that prayer more than anyone knew. Her rent was late, her younger brother was in college, and her savings had almost disappeared. Her manager, Victoria Stone, treated Lydia like a mistake the hotel had accidentally hired. When Lydia worked well, Victoria took credit. When problems came, Lydia took blame. Victoria often told her that girls like her should be grateful for crumbs. She said Lydia belonged near back doors, not beside guests with expensive watches. Lydia never answered back. She wanted to. Some days her throat burned with words, but she swallowed them because she needed the job. She was not perfect. Some nights she cried into her pillow. Some mornings she wanted to stop being gentle, because gentleness seemed to cost too much. But whenever bitterness tried to grow inside her, she remembered her mother Margaret saying, "God remembers mercy shown when nobody is clapping." That sentence lived inside Lydia like a small lamp. It did not remove her pain, but it kept the pain from turning her cruel. Victoria had not always been like that. Years ago, she had entered hospitality believing hotels should welcome people, not divide them by clothing and money. But she learned quickly that softness was punished. Rich guests rewarded arrogance. Senior managers promoted coldness. Little by little, Victoria buried the kind woman she once wanted to be. Melissa, one of the waitresses, was worse in a different way. She mocked Lydia's shoes, her quiet prayers, and her second-hand uniform every chance she got. Melissa pretended to be wealthy, but the truth was sadder. She owed money on designer bags and rented the apartment she claimed her father bought. Her cruelty was a costume, just like her jewelry. If people believed Lydia was beneath her, maybe nobody would notice Melissa was barely holding herself together. That Friday afternoon, the rain began before lunch and hit the tall windows so hard the city outside looked blurred, grey, and almost lonely. The restaurant was full of politicians, business people, and rich families hiding from the storm while eating food arranged like artwork on porcelain plates. Lydia moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, carrying orders, and trying not to limp because her feet had been hurting since morning. Then the glass doors opened and a small old woman stepped inside with a soaked grey coat, muddy shoes, and a torn grocery bag in one hand. The hostess froze, as if dirt itself had entered the room. 2 guests looked away. Melissa covered her nose, though the woman had barely taken 3 steps. Victoria saw her from across the restaurant and marched forward immediately. Her heels struck the marble floor like a warning nobody needed explained. Victoria looked the old woman up and down and said coldly that this was a private hotel restaurant, not a place for people from the street. The old woman lifted tired eyes and said softly that the rain was heavy. She only needed to sit for a moment until it slowed. Victoria smiled without warmth and told her there were bus stops for that. Some guests laughed quietly, and the old woman lowered her eyes. Lydia saw the woman's trembling hands before anything else. She saw fingers stiff with cold, and a face trying not to beg for dignity. And here is what nobody in that restaurant understood. Lydia did not see an interruption. She saw someone's mother standing wet and hungry. Lydia set down the pitcher she was carrying, walked toward them, and gently told the old woman she could sit near the corner. Victoria turned so sharply her earrings shook. She asked Lydia if anyone had invited her to interfere with hotel standards. Lydia swallowed, but she kept her voice soft. She said the woman was cold, and she would take responsibility if anyone complained. Victoria repeated the word responsibility like it was a joke. Then she looked at Lydia's worn shoes and asked if Lydia even owned those. Melissa laughed first. Then another waiter joined her. Lydia's face burned, but she did not step away from the old woman. Lydia said quietly that she would bring the woman something warm from her own meal break. She only needed a few minutes. Victoria stared at her, then smiled in the way Lydia had learned to fear. She said if Lydia loved charity, she could pay for it herself. Lydia nodded. She guided the old woman to a small corner table, away from the wealthiest guests, and placed a clean napkin beside her. She asked if the woman wanted water or tea. Ruth looked up with surprise and said tea would be kind if it was not trouble. Lydia smiled and said it was not trouble. She added that she would bring soup too, because the old woman looked terribly cold. Ruth studied her face and said Lydia spoke to her like she mattered, even though Lydia did not know her. Lydia answered simply that she did matter. Everyone did. Ruth lowered her eyes then, but this time it was not from shame. As Lydia walked toward the kitchen, Melissa whispered that Saint Lydia was feeding street people in a 5-star hotel. Another waiter joked that maybe the old woman would tip her with a prayer. Lydia heard them, but kept walking. In the kitchen, Lydia took the meal she had saved for herself. Chicken soup, bread, and a little rice wrapped for later. The chef noticed and told her that was her food. Lydia said she knew. He reminded her she had already worked 10 hours. Lydia smiled tiredly and said she still had enough strength to work a little hungry. Then she carried the tray back out. She placed the soup before Ruth, warning her that it was hot. Steam rose between them like a small mercy in a cold room. Ruth held the spoon for a long moment before eating. Her eyes stayed on Lydia, as if trying to remember where she had seen that kindness before. Ruth asked Lydia's name. When Lydia answered, Ruth smiled and said Lydia was a good name, a woman in scripture who opened her home. Lydia said her mother had chosen it for that reason. Ruth's face softened, and she said Margaret Carter had chosen well. Lydia froze slightly. She had not told Ruth her mother's name. But before she could ask, Victoria began approaching with 2 security guards. Victoria announced that the charity performance was over. She told Ruth to leave and ordered Lydia to come to her office immediately. Ruth rose slowly and said there was no need for force. Her voice was quiet, but something in it made the guards hesitate. Lydia helped Ruth to the doors. Outside, the rain had softened, but the street was wet, cold, and crowded with rushing people. Lydia took the last folded bill from her apron pocket. She had meant to use it for bus fare and bread. She pressed it into Ruth's hand and told her to take a taxi. The rain might return, and she should not walk far. Ruth stared at the money. She asked if Lydia had given away her meal, and now her fare too. Lydia smiled, though her voice shook. She said God would provide another way home. Ruth closed her fingers around the bill and whispered that yes, he would. Then she told Lydia to remember that day. She said kindness may look small when someone gives it, but heaven knows how to multiply it. Lydia did not understand, but tears filled her eyes. When Lydia entered Victoria's office, Melissa was already there, leaning against the wall with a pleased smile Lydia knew too well. Victoria sat behind her desk, like a judge, holding Lydia's employee badge between 2 fingers. She asked if Lydia understood what she had done. Lydia said she had helped a hungry old woman. Victoria snapped that Lydia had embarrassed paying guests and damaged the image of the hotel. Victoria said the Grand Aurelia was business, not church. Lydia looked at her sadly and said, maybe business should still have a heart. Melissa laughed and said Lydia thought she was preaching. Victoria stood, placed the badge on the desk, and fired her, effective immediately. The word fired landed like a slap. Lydia thought of rent, her brother's school fees, and the empty refrigerator waiting at home. But she also thought of Ruth's trembling hands around the soup bowl. So she removed her apron and laid it gently on the desk. Lydia said she was sorry Victoria saw mercy as a disgrace. Victoria's face hardened, and she told Lydia to get out. Lydia walked through the kitchen one last time. Some workers looked guilty, some entertained, and some afraid. Nobody defended her. At the staff exit, the rain started again. Lydia stepped outside without an umbrella, holding her small bag tightly against her chest. She walked home slowly through the wet streets, not knowing where work would come from, not knowing how she would pay rent. She did not know Ruth was already inside a black car 2 streets away, still holding the wrinkled bill like treasure. The driver opened the door with deep respect and asked if he should call Mr. Montgomery. Ruth looked through the rain and said yes. Then Ruth Montgomery, mother of Ethan Montgomery, CEO of the entire hotel chain, said softly, "Tell my son I found what I was looking for." Years earlier, Ruth and her late husband built Montgomery Hospitality from one small roadside inn into one of the country's largest hotel groups. Ruth still remembered him standing in the first kitchen before sunrise, sleeves rolled up, checking on tired cooks before he ever checked the accounts. Every time a new hotel opened, he repeated the same thing. "This place is not a palace for the rich. It is a table." And at that table, he would say, nobody hungry should be treated like trash. Ruth heard his voice every time she entered one of their hotels. But after his death, The company became more polished and less human. Luxury increased. Mercy quietly disappeared behind branding, protocol, and profit. Ruth had heard reports for months. Poor visitors removed, workers bullied, food wasted, staff trained to serve wealth before dignity. At first, she wanted to believe the reports were exaggerated. Then one night, she dreamed of her husband looking at an empty dining room and saying nothing. So she dressed like someone the hotel would despise and walked in to see what kind of heart her husband's company still had. She found cruelty, she found pride, but in one exhausted waitress with wet shoes and tired eyes, she also found a reason to hope. That evening, Ethan Montgomery stood by the window of his private office, 40 floors above the city, watching rain slide down the glass. People called Ethan brilliant, disciplined, and untouchable. His investors admired him, his employees feared him. His mother said success had made him lonely. When his assistant Marcus told him Ruth wanted restaurant security footage, Ethan frowned. He asked why his mother was investigating his own hotel. Marcus hesitated and said Ruth believed Ethan needed to see how the hotel treated the people Jesus would have sat beside. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Only his mother could make a security issue sound like a sermon and still be right. 10 minutes later, Ethan sat beside Ruth in the security room while the footage from the restaurant filled the screen. He saw Ruth enter in wet clothes. He saw staff mock her. He saw Victoria approach his mother like she was a stain. His jaw tightened. Ruth said nothing. She did not need to. The screen was already preaching louder than she could. Then Ethan saw Lydia step forward. He saw her defend Ruth, seat her, feed her, and give her money from her apron. Nobody in the room spoke. Even the security chief looked ashamed. Ethan leaned forward when Victoria arrived with guards. Then he watched Lydia enter Victoria's office. There was no audio, but the body language told enough. Victoria pointed. Melissa laughed. Lydia removed her apron. Ethan's voice dropped when he said they had fired her. Ruth looked at him and answered, "For feeding me." Shame pressed against Ethan's chest. The hotel carried his name. The cruelty had happened under his roof, through systems he claimed to control. He told Marcus to find Lydia. Then he looked at Victoria's frozen image and demanded every complaint ever filed against that manager. While Ethan searched for her, Lydia sat in her small apartment with wet hair, an empty plate, and one candle burning on the table. The electricity had been cut again. Her phone showed messages from her landlord and one from her brother asking if everything was okay. Lydia typed that everything was fine, then deleted it. She did not want to lie, but she did not want him worrying during exams. She opened her mother's old Bible and found the verse in Matthew. "I was hungry, and you gave me food." She laughed softly through tears and whispered that she had given soup, but now she did not know how to pay rent. A knock sounded at the door. Not the landlord's knock. This one was careful, formal, and strangely respectful. When Lydia opened the door, Marcus stood outside in a dark suit, holding an umbrella. Behind him waited a black luxury car. He asked if she was Lydia Carter. When she said yes, he introduced himself as Ethan Montgomery's executive assistant. Lydia stared at him and said he had the wrong person. Marcus smiled gently and said Ruth Montgomery had sent him personally. Lydia whispered. The old woman. Marcus said yes, then added that for once, someone had done something right. Lydia almost refused. It all felt impossible. But then she remembered Ruth saying God would provide another way home. So she locked her apartment, stepped back into the rain, and followed Marcus toward the car that would change the rest of her life. The Montgomery estate rose behind iron gates like something from another world, with white columns, glowing windows, and gardens shining under rain. Lydia sat stiffly in the back seat, afraid to touch anything. Her shoes were damp, and her uniform still smelled faintly of soup. When the front door opened, Ruth stood inside wearing a cream dress and pearls. But her eyes were the same kind eyes from the restaurant. Lydia stopped walking and whispered, "Mama?" Ruth smiled and told her to come in, because Lydia had fed her, and now Ruth would feed Lydia properly. Lydia asked if Ruth lived there. Ruth smiled sadly and said she had lived there many years, though wealth had not protected her from disappointment. Ethan appeared at the foot of the staircase in a dark suit, controlled and still. But his eyes stayed fixed on Lydia with quiet intensity. He told Lydia he owed her an apology. She looked confused and asked why he would owe her anything. Ethan said his staff had humiliated his mother, then fired Lydia for compassion. It happened in his hotel, so, yes, he owed her. Lydia looked from Ethan to Ruth and back again. "Your mother?" Ruth chuckled and said she had forgotten to mention that part during the soup. For the first time that day, Lydia laughed through tears. Ruth touched her shoulder and said God had been in the middle of it. At dinner, Lydia waited until Ruth encouraged her twice before touching the silverware. Ethan noticed that she seemed embarrassed by kindness, not hungry for advantage. After the meal, Ethan placed an envelope on the table. He said it was compensation for how the hotel had treated her. Lydia did not touch it. She said she could not accept money for feeding his mother because then kindness would start looking like a transaction. Ruth's eyes shone. Ethan leaned back, surprised despite himself. Then he asked Lydia what she wanted instead. Lydia looked at her hands and said she wanted honest work, somewhere she would not be punished for treating people like human beings. Ethan turned to Marcus and asked him to prepare a temporary contract for the guest relations audit team, reporting directly to his office. Lydia looked up quickly and said she was only a waitress. Ethan answered that she was the only person in his restaurant who understood hospitality. Ruth smiled and said that was rarer than a degree. Lydia did not know how to answer, so she simply whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, Victoria arrived at the Grand Aurelia expecting control. Instead, she found the regional director in her office with security. When he said she was suspended pending investigation, Victoria laughed once. Then he said Ethan Montgomery had ordered it, and her face lost colour. By noon, every staff member knew. The old woman was the CEO's mother. Lydia had been brought to the estate. Victoria was finished. Melissa nearly dropped a tray when she heard. She kept saying it could not be true, because if it was true, her cruelty had witnesses now. 3 days later, Lydia walked back into the Grand Aurelia. Not through the staff exit, but through the main lobby beside Marcus. She wore a modest navy dress Ruth had sent, though Lydia had argued it was too expensive. Her old Bible rested inside her bag. Employees watched her like she had become dangerous. The same mouths that mocked her now closed when she passed. Marcus handed her a tablet and explained she would observe service standards, staff conduct, guest complaints, and how vulnerable visitors were treated. Lydia whispered that it felt like too much. Marcus said mercy often feels too small until someone gives it authority. That afternoon, Ethan held a staff meeting in the dining room. He did not shout. His calm voice frightened people more than shouting would have. He said his mother entered dressed like a poor woman, and most of them treated her exactly how they believed poor people deserved to be treated. Nobody breathed loudly. Even Melissa lowered her eyes. Ethan said one waitress remembered what the company had forgotten. He told them hospitality was not worshipping the wealthy. It was honouring human dignity, especially when there was no profit in doing it. Then his eyes landed on Melissa. He said anyone who mocked or neglected a vulnerable person would leave the company before sunset. Lydia stood at the side of the room, cheeks warm, wishing she could disappear. She did not want revenge. She wanted cruelty to stop. But some people did not change. They only became quieter. And quiet cruelty is sometimes harder to see before it strikes. The most dangerous person watching Lydia was Celeste Waverley, Ethan's public relations partner, and the woman society assumed he would eventually marry. Celeste was elegant, connected, and perfectly trained for every room. She believed she loved Ethan, but slowly she realized she loved his name more. That truth humiliated her. She had built her future around becoming Mrs. Montgomery, and a former waitress had disturbed the picture. When Celeste first heard about Lydia, she laughed and called her the soup girl. But when Ruth held Lydia's hand like family, Celeste stopped laughing. At the estate, Celeste smiled sweetly and told Lydia she cleaned up well. Ruth replied that kindness cleaned people better than money ever could. Celeste's smile tightened. Ethan noticed, though he said nothing. Lydia noticed too, and her stomach warned her that trouble had entered, wearing perfume. In the audit section, Lydia's work became heavier than she expected. She reviewed hotel systems, interviewed workers, and read complaints nobody had wanted to answer. At first, the audit sounded administrative. Forms, logs, policies, vendor contracts. But behind each file, Lydia found a person trying not to break. A housekeeper named Anna cried while admitting she cleaned 14 rooms a day because supervisors threatened to replace her with someone younger. A dishwasher named Peter showed Lydia burn scars on his wrist and said he never reported them because injured workers were called careless. One doorman kept looking at the office door during his interview. He whispered that if management learned he had spoken, his schedule would disappear. Lydia left that meeting and sat alone in the stairwell. For the first time, the job felt too heavy for her small hands. She whispered that she was only one woman and could not fix a whole building full of fear. That night, Ethan found her still working in a conference room, surrounded by reports and half-finished notes, her tea untouched beside her laptop. He said nothing at first. He only placed a fresh cup of tea beside her and moved the cold one away. Lydia looked up, exhausted. Ethan said softly that she did not have to carry the whole hotel in one night. Lydia answered that some people had carried it for years while nobody listened. Ethan looked down because he knew she was right. In another meeting, Lydia gently corrected Ethan in front of department heads. She said the new policy still protected the brand more than the workers. The room went silent. Marcus stared at his notes. Ethan looked at Lydia for a long moment, and everyone expected him to cut her down. Instead, he thanked her and changed the policy. Later, privately, he told Lydia she had done what nobody else dared to do. She said he had made it hard for people to tell him the truth. Ethan did not defend himself. That was when he knew she was changing him. The audit discovered that staff meal funds and community food donations had been quietly diverted through vendors connected to Victoria. Food meant for workers and the poor had been resold, while employees were told budgets were tight and compassion was not operationally efficient. When Lydia showed Ethan the evidence, he went very still. He asked how long it had been happening, though his face already feared the answer. Lydia said at least 2 years, maybe longer. Ethan whispered that it had happened under his watch. Lydia answered carefully that it happened under a system that taught people to fear disappointing rich guests more than mistreating poor workers. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and said she was not afraid of him. Lydia said she was, but she feared silence more. Celeste saw the shift between them before either Lydia or Ethan named it. He asked Lydia's opinion. He waited for her words. To Celeste, that was worse than flirting. Ethan was not merely interested in Lydia. He was listening to her. So Celeste planned an accusation that would not look like restaurant cruelty. It would look like proof Lydia had wanted wealth all along. During a charity planning dinner at the estate, Ruth's diamond bracelet disappeared from her bedroom. It was a family piece, worth more than Lydia's apartment building. Celeste stood near the doorway, with one hand on her chest. She said she hated to mention it, but Lydia had been upstairs earlier. Lydia froze. She had gone to Ruth's room only to bring her shawl. But suddenly, every face in the room turned toward her. Celeste said she was not accusing anyone. She was only saying what she saw. That sentence sounded innocent and poisonous at the same time. For the first time since returning to the hotel, Lydia felt truly alone. Ruth was not in the room yet. Marcus had stepped outside. Ethan was delayed in a call. Security stood by the doors. Staff stared at Lydia's plain dress as if poverty itself were evidence. A guard asked Lydia to open her purse. Her hands shook so badly, she almost dropped it. For one terrible second, Lydia doubted herself. Not because she had stolen, but because she had learned how easily innocent people could be crushed. She wondered if maybe kindness had carried her into a room too powerful for her to survive. When the purse was opened, the bracelet was inside. The room went cold. Lydia stared at it, unable to breathe. She had never seen the bracelet before, but there it was, among her things. Celeste covered her mouth. Melissa, hired as temporary event staff, whispered loudly that she had warned people about girls who climbed too fast. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but no words came. This time, even her own voice seemed to abandon her. Then, Ruth entered the room. She looked at the bracelet, then at Lydia, and said with quiet certainty, "She did not take it." Celeste replied that even kind people could be tempted. Ruth's eyes sharpened, but Ethan arrived before she could answer. He looked at Lydia's trembling hands, then at the bracelet, then at Celeste. His voice was low, when he ordered every camera reviewed immediately. Celeste said some hallways had no cameras. Ethan turned slowly and asked why she knew that. The first footage showed Lydia entering Ruth's room with a shawl and leaving empty-handed. The second showed Celeste entering the hallway 6 minutes later. Then another angle showed Melissa slipping into a side door with a small velvet pouch, and later passing close to Lydia's unattended purse. Melissa broke first. She cried that Celeste had promised money and a better position if she helped prove Lydia was a thief. Celeste's face emptied of colour. Ruth closed her eyes and said a woman who fed the hungry had been accused by women stealing from the full. Ethan ended the business partnership that night. He told Celeste she wanted his family name, but did not understand his family's God. Celeste's mask cracked. She said Lydia did not deserve any of it. Not the house, not Ruth, not Ethan's attention. Lydia surprised everyone by stepping forward and saying she knew she did not deserve grace. That was why she received it with trembling. Ethan looked at her, standing, shaken but honest, and something in him opened that no business victory had ever touched. The bracelet scheme was exposed, but the damage still spilled outside. By morning, gossip sites claimed Lydia had manipulated a lonely billionaire family. Victoria leaked old staff rumours. Melissa cried online. Celeste gave interviews through friends and called herself a victim of a carefully staged charity image. One comment said she had probably fed Ruth only because she recognised expensive hands. Lydia read it twice. Then her thumb stopped moving and her eyes dropped to the floor. Lydia woke to thousands of hateful comments. Gold digger, soup actress, church girl with a plan. She turned off her phone and sat shaking. Ruth found her in the guest room, holding her Bible without reading. She said, "Truth can be loud, but lies usually scream first." Lydia whispered that maybe she should leave, because Ruth's family had peace before she came. Ruth answered that silence was not always peace. That afternoon, Ethan called a press conference in the Grand Aurelia ballroom. His lawyers wanted caution. Ethan wanted evidence. Reporters filled the room. Cameras flashed. Celeste arrived in white, trying to look wounded. Victoria came, hoping to enjoy Lydia's fall. Ethan walked onto the stage with Ruth beside him and Lydia behind them. He said several lies had been told, and today, evidence would answer. The screen lit up with restaurant footage. Ruth entered in wet clothes. Staff mocked her. Victoria rejected her. Then Lydia stepped forward. The room watched Lydia feed Ruth, protect her, and press taxi money into her hand. The ballroom became so quiet, Lydia could hear cameras clicking. Ethan said this was the woman called a gold digger. She gave when she had almost nothing. Ruth stepped forward and said Lydia had helped her not because of her name, not for reward, but because her heart recognized another heart. Then the estate footage played. Celeste, Melissa, the bracelet, the planted accusation. Gasps spread through the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Victoria tried to leave, but security blocked the exit. Celeste stood frozen as the beautiful story she had performed collapsed under ordinary video evidence. Ethan announced legal action against everyone involved and immediate reforms across the hotel group. Then, the reporters turned toward Lydia. They shouted questions about Ethan, money, fame, love, and revenge. Lydia gripped the podium because the room felt larger than her courage. She said only that people should remember to feed the hungry before judging their clothes. That simple line went viral before evening. Public vindication did not make Lydia feel powerful. It made her visible. And being visible meant strangers now thought they owned pieces of her story. People recognized her on streets. Some blessed her, some mocked her. Some wanted money. Some wanted proof she was not as good as the footage showed. Ethan saw the pressure changing her and blamed himself. One evening, he found Lydia sitting alone in the forgotten chapel inside the hotel. She was not praying loudly. She sat in the back pew with folded hands, tears running quietly down her face. Ethan sat 2 rows behind her and apologized for putting her goodness on display like evidence. Lydia said maybe goodness needed to be evidence sometimes, because people believed cruelty was normal when they saw it everywhere. Ethan asked if she always turned pain into lessons. Lydia smiled through tears and said, "No. Sometimes she turned it into headaches first." He laughed softly. It was the first uncontrolled laugh Lydia had heard from him, and somehow the chapel felt warmer afterward. Their romance did not begin like gossip said. It began quietly, in kitchens, audit rooms, chapel pews, and late nights with paper cups of tea. Ethan brought Lydia tea when she forgot to eat. Lydia corrected him when policies sounded good but protected power more than people. One night, while reviewing old charity records, Lydia found a scanned document that made her go completely still. She pointed at a name and whispered, "Ethan, that was my mother." The record said Margaret Carter had worked in the First Montgomery Hotel kitchen. Ethan called Ruth immediately. Ruth came into the study wrapped in a shawl, expecting another audit question. Then she saw the name. Her hand flew to her mouth. She whispered, "Margaret Carter. Your mother was Margaret Carter." Lydia nodded, confused. She asked if Ruth had known her. Ruth sat down slowly because her legs suddenly seemed weak. Ruth said yes. Then she closed her eyes and said Lydia's mother had saved her life. The room became so still that even Ethan did not move. Lydia stared at Ruth, waiting for a story her mother had never told her. Ruth began slowly. She said it happened 20 years earlier, before the Grand Aurelia existed, when the Montgomerys owned only one tired hotel near the highway. There had been a storm that night too. A kitchen fire started after an electrical fault, and smoke filled the back corridor faster than anyone expected. Ruth had gone toward the storage room to help a young worker, but the door jammed. People were shouting outside. The smoke became thick. She remembered coughing, falling to her knees, and thinking that her son Ethan was still young and might lose both parents one day. Then Margaret Carter ran back through the smoke. Ruth said Margaret's face was wrapped in a wet towel and her eyes were fierce with fear and faith. Margaret pulled Ruth by the shoulders, burned her own arm against a metal handle, and refused to let Ruth stop moving, even when Ruth could barely stand. When they reached safety, Margaret collapsed outside on the wet pavement, still asking if everyone else had escaped. Ruth tried to reward her later. Money, promotion, medical bills, anything. But Margaret only accepted treatment and returned to the kitchen when she healed. Ruth said Margaret told her that God had not saved her so she could watch another woman die behind a door. Lydia began crying. She knew the scar on her mother's arm. She had touched it as a child and asked where it came from. Her mother had only said, "Some fires were worth walking through if someone else was trapped inside." Ruth's voice broke. She said Margaret left after management changed, and Ruth searched for her, but never found where she had gone. Lydia whispered that her mother never told her because she never liked making goodness sound heroic. Ethan watched both women cry. His mother, saved by Margaret. Lydia, daughter of Margaret. And between them, a debt of mercy finally finding its way home. For a long moment, nobody said anything. They just sat there together, crying quietly, because there was nothing small enough to say. Then Ruth reached for Lydia's hand and said, maybe God had brought Margaret's daughter back to finish a kindness that started before Lydia was born. Ethan looked at Lydia differently after that, not because she became more impressive, but because her kindness suddenly had roots deeper than he imagined. The mother reveal changed everything, but quietly. Ruth did not announce it to the press. Lydia did not want her mother turned into a headline. Instead, they placed Margaret's photo in Ruth's private sitting room, beside Ethan's father's portrait, where gratitude could sit without cameras. Soon after, Ruth asked Lydia to help rebuild the company's charitable mission as director of a new program called The Open Table. Lydia refused at first. She said she had no qualifications. Ruth answered that Lydia had the burden, and burdens for people could not be faked. Some board members objected. One said they were running hotels, not churches. Lydia answered that hotels should stop pretending hospitality had nothing to do with the soul. Ruth nearly smiled. Ethan did not hide his. The board member looked down at his papers and said nothing else. The Open Table launched 1 month later in the same restaurant where Lydia had been fired. The white tablecloths were replaced with long wooden tables. There were bowls of soup, fresh bread, rice, fruit, tea, and volunteers in simple aprons. Some staff served stiffly at first. One young waiter named Daniel complained that opening the restaurant to homeless people would scare away luxury guests. Lydia did not scold him. She handed him a tray and asked him to serve 1 bowl before deciding what kind of people had entered. Daniel served an elderly man whose hands shook so badly soup spilled onto the table. The man apologized again and again, ashamed of needing help. Daniel wiped the spill quietly. Then he brought the man extra bread without being asked. Later, Lydia saw Daniel standing in the kitchen, blinking hard. He said the old man reminded him of his grandfather, who had died alone. That night, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez came with 2 grandchildren. She tried to sit near the door in case someone told her to leave. Lydia sat beside her and said no one would remove her. Mrs. Alvarez whispered that she had not eaten at a table with flowers in years. Lydia had to step into the kitchen to cry. Ruth found her there and simply held her hand. Ethan watched from the edge of the room as workers, guests, and strangers shared space without fear. His father's old sentence came back to him. A hotel is a table. And for the first time in years, Ethan saw that table become real. Victoria, however, was not finished. Humiliated and unemployed, she joined Celeste in one last attempt to destroy Lydia and Ethan together. They leaked a false story, claiming the open table was a money laundering scheme. They forged invoices and bribed a junior accountant to make Lydia look guilty. The accusation was worse than the bracelet because it attacked the thing Lydia loved most. News channels said she had stolen from charity meals. Lydia watched the headline in silence. Her face did not change, but her hands began to shake. Ethan was furious. Ruth became quiet, which Marcus knew was more dangerous. Ruth said they would investigate because truth did not fear paperwork. For 3 days, Lydia avoided cameras, but kept serving meals. Photographers waited outside, hoping to capture shame on her face. A little boy in the meal line asked if she was going to stop feeding them. Lydia knelt and told him the kitchen was not closed. Behind her, Ethan heard every word, and in that moment, he knew Lydia's strength did not come from applause. The internal audit exposed the forged invoices. The junior accountant confessed and named Victoria. Victoria, facing arrest, named Celeste. Celeste tried to leave the country, but Ethan found her at a private airport lounge with 2 police officers and a folder of evidence. Celeste called it dramatic. Ethan said she had framed an innocent woman twice and stolen from hungry people to punish someone for feeding them. Celeste said Lydia had ruined everything. Ethan answered that Lydia had revealed everything. The officers led Celeste away. For the first time, her perfect posture failed, and fear showed through the expensive clothes. Victoria was arrested the same evening. Melissa lost her right to work in luxury hospitality after evidence showed she helped with both schemes. The next morning, Lydia asked to speak at the press conference. She stood at the podium with her mother's Bible under her hand. She said people asked if she forgave those who hurt her. She said yes. But forgiveness did not mean giving cruelty the keys again. She said mercy feeds the hungry, truth protects the innocent, and justice stops the cruel from hurting the next person. Ruth closed her eyes and whispered, Amen. Across the country, people shared Lydia's words more than any statement Ethan's team had written. Months passed. The open table expanded across the hotel chain. Some luxury guests complained, but many more began paying for strangers' meals. Churches partnered with hotels. Workers smiled more. Complaints changed. Guests noticed warmth where there had once been fear. Ethan changed too. He stopped measuring success only by occupancy and expansion. He visited kitchens without cameras and learned names he once walked past. One evening, he found Lydia arranging donated coats in the lobby before a winter meal. He told her he used to think kindness was something companies sponsored after profit. Lydia asked what he thought now. Ethan said profit without kindness was only expensive emptiness. Lydia laughed and said Ruth had definitely been preaching to him. Ethan stepped closer and said Ruth was not the only one. The air between them changed, and Lydia suddenly forgot the coat in her hands. He noticed then that he had started checking whether Lydia had eaten before checking his own messages. It had happened quietly, without permission. He had also started measuring decisions by a question he never said out loud. What would Lydia see here that I might miss? He said he knew the world had invented stories about them, and he did not want to use those stories to pressure her. But somewhere between watching her feed his mother and watching her fight for people who could not repay her, he had fallen in love. Lydia looked down, overwhelmed. She said she was still learning to stand in rooms like that without feeling small. Ethan said he would stand beside her, not above her. Lydia asked if he promised. Ethan said yes, and meant it. Tears filled her eyes. She said she thought she had fallen in love with him too. Ruth watched from the doorway and quietly stepped away. They did not make the relationship public immediately. Lydia wanted time, and Ethan respected that more than the gossip pages respected anything. At the Open Table Anniversary Gala, they arrived not through the front entrance, but through the kitchen, carrying trays of bread. Ethan spoke about his father's vision, Ruth's faith, Margaret Carter's courage, and Lydia's mercy. Then he turned toward Lydia, before the whole ballroom, and said she had fed his mother, his company, and his life. He knelt with a simple ring, a small diamond, beside an engraved wheat stalk, and asked Lydia to build a table with him forever. Lydia cried before he finished. Ruth cried too. Half the staff were crying openly, even workers who pretended they never cried. Lydia whispered, "Yes." Then she laughed through tears and said yes louder. The applause shook the ballroom. The wedding, when it came, was beautiful, but not because it was expensive. It was beautiful because it finally felt peaceful. There were flowers, music, reporters, and guests in elegant clothes. But Lydia asked that the first rows be reserved for open table families. Elderly women, single fathers, former hotel workers, students, widows, and people once kept outside luxury doors, now sat inside the cathedral. When Lydia walked down the aisle, they stood first. Ethan saw them and had to swallow before he could smile. Ruth leaned toward him and whispered that his father would have loved this. Ethan could not answer because his throat was too tight. Lydia wore a graceful white dress, simple enough to still feel like herself. Ruth pinned Margaret's small silver cross inside the lining. Lydia touched it before the vows, remembering her mother's hands, her kitchen prayers, and the scar Ruth had finally explained. Lydia vowed to choose mercy when pride would be easier. Ethan vowed to listen when God used her to show him what he could not see. The minister smiled and said their home should be a table, not a throne. Ruth whispered that this was a very good sermon. After the wedding, they did not rush into a fairy tale. They returned to work, family, prayer, and the slow building of a different kind of life. 1 year later, the Grand Aurelia restaurant still glittered, but one section stayed open every evening for people who could not pay. Some wealthy guests complained at first, then many began asking quietly if they could pay for the meals of strangers. Every new trainee learned one rule before learning table numbers or wine service. Every guest carries the image of God. One rainy afternoon, a young trainee named Noah hesitated near the entrance. Outside stood a homeless man, drenched and ashamed to step inside. The man kept his eyes low. He whispered that he did not want to cause trouble. He could leave if this place was only for guests. Noah looked back toward the dining room. Old fear moved through him, the fear of doing the wrong thing and being punished. Then he saw Lydia watching from near the corner table. She did not speak, she only nodded. Noah opened the door wider and said, "Sir, please come in. Let us get you something warm." The homeless man stepped inside slowly, as if warmth itself might reject him. The room changed, but not with laughter. A waiter brought a towel, Daniel brought soup. A guest moved her chair to make space. Noah looked almost surprised by the kindness he had started. Lydia watched quietly as the story began again. But this time, nobody mocked, nobody pointed, and nobody called mercy a disgrace. Ruth sat nearby with tea in her hands, older now and slower, but still watching everything, like she could see beneath the surface. She asked Lydia if she remembered the day she gave her soup. Lydia laughed softly and said she remembered being very hungry afterward. Ruth smiled and said, "And now look how many have eaten because you were willing to be hungry for one afternoon." Lydia looked around the restaurant. Workers served gently. Guests shared tables. A child laughed over bread. An old woman prayed with folded hands. Lydia said it was not just her. God had taken one bowl and made it bigger. Ruth nodded and said that was usually how he worked. Ethan entered carrying their baby daughter, little Margaret Ruth Montgomery, named after both women whose kindness had shaped their lives. The baby reached for Lydia, and Ethan smiled, saying she had refused to nap until she saw the dining room. Lydia kissed her daughter's forehead and said that meant she was definitely part of the family. Ethan looked toward the corner table, then at the people eating freely inside his most profitable hotel. He said he used to think Ruth had tested the hotel that day. Lydia smiled and said she had. Ethan shook his head softly and said God had tested it. Ruth had only been brave enough to obey. Outside, rain moved down the windows, but inside the room was warm, full of voices, soup, bread, and quiet grace. Years later, people still called it a Cinderella story. Lydia never did. She said she had not been trying to change her life. She had only been trying not to let the world change her heart. Ruth would always answer with the same final words. "That is where every miracle begins, my child." And at the corner table, beneath the soft restaurant lights, one empty bowl waited beside fresh bread. Just in case Mercy walked in hungry again.